think people will dribble in as we keep going. But in the meantime, thanks very much for coming, as it were, this morning and taking time out of your Saturday mornings to listen to a lecture or lesson on Madame Bovary. But hopefully it'll be a fun and informative experience. I am Adam, and I'm a student, PhD student at the University of Oxford. I study French literature, and in particular I study modernist prose, so just after when Flaubert is writing, but I'm a very big fan of Flaubert's work. And the purpose of this course is this taster session is to give you a taster of the course that I'm going to be teaching with LinguaTute's, where we go through the canon of French writing, by which I mean the classics of French writing, and try to give you a sense of the landscape of French literature from about the 16th century right up until the present day. In that course, what we're going to be doing is going through some of the canonical classic authors, talking a little bit about the historical context and literary context in which they're set, and then looking at specific texts that we will choose for you to look at. And in a sense, this is a sort of microcosm of what we'd be doing in a more extended lesson, probably an hour and a half long lesson over 8 weeks. I'm here, and we also have Fionn here, who is Miss LinguaTute herself, to answer any questions if you have on the sort of more administrative side of the course, how it's going to work at the end. I'm imagining pitching these lessons at a lot of people who are doing, say, A-level French and want to know more generally about the French literary landscape, but lots of people who are just might have French literature as a hobby, or are out of education and just generally wish to be informed on French literature as a whole. And I'm aiming to pitch them at the lectures at roughly, say, first year undergraduate level. So it's going to be a bit of it might be a little bit tough for you if you're 16 or 17 listening to this. And we're very open to feedback if it seems a little too overwhelming. But I'm saying this so that you feel if you don't understand everything, it is intended to be a little bit challenging. It's intended to challenge you. Particularly the passage we picked is intended to be challenging in the French, challenging in the themes discussed, challenging in its language, and so on. So in this lesson, I'm going to give about 20-25 minutes worth of talk about Flaubert, his context, why I particularly like Flaubert. He's one of my favorite writers. And then hopefully we'll have about 20 minutes where we can discuss the passage, which hopefully has been emailed to you. Hopefully some of you have attempted to have a look at. Throughout, I can't exactly tell body language and comprehension. So feel very free to put in the chat if you don't understand something or you want to ask a question. Treat this a bit like a classroom, I would say. There's about 20 of us here, so it's perfectly fine to go ahead and ask me to repeat myself and so on, or there'll be a space at the end for questions. Okay, so without further preamble, today's lesson is on Gustave Flaubert, the French novelist, and his most famous work, which is Madame Bovary. To give you a sense of where Flaubert is coming from, I thought I'd give a quick outline of his life, which is not a particularly interesting life, as lives go. It's basically dominated by his work. He was born in 1821 to a fairly wealthy French family. His father was a doctor. He goes through life following a standard course, more or less, until he's 20. He does the baccalaureate, which is the French equivalent of A-levels. And then he enrolls into a university in Paris to study law. However, whether he actually ever does study law in Paris is a bit of a vexed question, because he spends the next 8 years sort of smoozing around Paris, not doing much studying, hobnobbing with the literary greats at the time, and in particular with romantic writers such as Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Misérables, which is the book that got turned into a musical later on, that you might come across, and George Sand, who was a female French Romantic writer, pretty much the equivalent of our George Eliot, and with whom he stayed in contact throughout his life. In 1848, you have a revolution in Paris. We tend to think, when we think of the French Revolution, we think of the revolution of 1789, where they deposed King Louis XVI, right? But that revolution was actually just the tip of the iceberg in terms of French revolutions. There have been many, many French revolutions and rebellions. 1848 was one of these. The original French Revolution, as it were, precipitated an instability that went on throughout the 19th century. It was initially supposed to be a democratic revolution. They were going to create a republic. And then the French First Republic was superseded by Napoleon, who was one of the Republic's generals. And he created an empire. Then Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. And the European powers at the time tried to restore the French monarchy. And what the result of these three very quick changes of government was that the French people, particularly people in Paris, were very divided on how they wanted to be governed. There were people who wanted a democracy, as it was after the First Revolution. There were people who wanted an empire, so who wanted Napoleon or Napoleon's heirs back. And then there were people who wanted a monarchy in one form or another. And the result of this is a 19th century where we constantly have switches of government. The 1848 revolution was one of these, where initially was intended to be a democratic revolution. Then it became an empire within a few months. And Flaubert was there on the streets of Paris watching this pandemonium, and he was unimpressed. He was largely unimpressed. And the revolution is satirized in his writing. He was more or less a political cynic, I will say. And once he has this experience of Paris and seeing the 1848 revolution, the sort of constant unrest and instability and churning of the French political world in the 19th century, he sort of retires to the countryside. And at the age of about 36, he begins to write. Spends 6 years writing Madame Bovary, which is an incredibly long period of time. 6 years on one novel, even in our age, is considered very, very a lengthy period of time for a novel to take for a writer. And in the context of the 19th century, it's was almost unthinkable. The big 19th century novelists sort of churned out their stuff, right? They're like Dickens. They're kind of writing serials every month, and they have a huge body of work. Think of Balzac, Zola, Victor Hugo. These are kind of big 19th century French novelists. Flaubert has a very small body of work. He spends about 5 years on each novel, and the rhythm that he takes on for Madame Bovary becomes the rhythm of the rest of his life. He spends another 5 years on his next novel, Salammbô, then another 5 years on his next novel, and then he tries to write another novel. It takes him about 6 years, and he dies before he finishes it. This is Bovary and Pécuchet. And these novels are experimental. They're right at the avant-garde of how writing was done at the time. But they were also big literary successes. They were bestsellers. So he had it both ways in a sense. He had critical success, and he also sold copies. And he's, in one sense, a very lucky writer to have invested so much time into producing novels. He was able to do that because he was wealthy, unlike, say, Balzac. He could spend 5 years writing a novel and having no income. And yet, after all of that investment of time and effort, huge amount of effort into each of these big novels, he reaped the rewards of writing like that. Again, in terms of critical success and in terms of getting copies off the shelves. Nothing ever beat, however, probably the success of Madame Bovary, possibly Salammbô, which is a novel we don't really read now. It's set in ancient Carthage. Madame Bovary was his big sort of breakout success. So the context in which he was writing was dominated by two big first half of the 19th century. The first one was Romanticism, and the second one was realism. Now, I wonder if anyone has come across these before. I don't know if anyone wants to hazard a guess of what I mean by romanticism or realism. That's exactly right. Yeah. I was about to say, when you think romanticism, you've got to think nature, like Wordsworth, Coleridge, getting to a taproot, trying to find out what's inside yourself, trying to get away from society. Right? Rousseau is a French romantic writer who is very critical of people caught up in big cities, whereas realist writers, their aesthetic is, in some sense, the contrary of that. French romanticism is like English romanticism, as you said. French realism is like English realism. I don't know if anyone can think of a kind of English, what we might think of as a realistic writer who's focused on cities, urbanity, society. Any guesses? Dickens, yeah, exactly. Dickens is the exact person I had in mind. He is the, if you like, the paradigmatic type of our English writer, English realist writer. Oliver Twist, Old Curiosity Shop. Interested in showing the ways in which society is sort of pummeling, particularly the working class. So this is the context in which Flaubert was writing, and he's often been called a naturalist writer. Now, naturalism and realism are very close, and I wouldn't necessarily expect anyone to know what we mean by naturalism because it's particularly associated with French literature. It was a term coined by Zola, who was a naturalist writer, essentially to brand his writing. But naturalism is in a sense, it came after realism, and it's a doubling down of realism. So imagine it as Dickens, all the intensity of Dickens, the poverty that's described, made more intense. It's more pessimistic about whether people are able to, as it were, get out of the traps that society builds for them, whether this is in coal mines, in the streets of Paris, and so on. And it's more realistic in the sense that it attempts to use science. So Flaubert, for example, he's the son of a doctor. And in Madame Bovary, there are anatomically very realistic descriptions of a surgery that occurs. Charles Bovary, Emma Bovary, Madame Bovary's husband is a doctor. There's also very realistic descriptions of arsenic poisoning. So it's in some sense more realistic than realism is what's the branding of naturalism. But today I want to make the case that Flaubert is much more than a naturalistic writer, and he can't really be pigeonholed in that way. One reason is because he wrote about things that aren't to do with the typical aesthetic of realism or naturalism. He said romanticism is, as it were, countryside, putting it simply. Realism is more interested in the city. Flaubert was interested in all sorts of things. He wrote a collection of short stories that I would recommend called the Trois Contes. If you don't like Madame Bovary, this is the other great place to start with Flaubert, not least because it's very short. It's about 60 pages. All three stories are 60 pages. And in there you see the full range of his interests, from a story about a maid and her pet parrot or stuffed parrot set in contemporary France, to a story set in the Middle Ages about a saint, to a story set in the time just before Jesus Christ's birth. So he had a whole range of eclectic tastes, not just the tastes of someone like Dickens, who never wrote about, say, medieval, ancient Carthage. Right. The other reason is his attitude to writing. What he expects, what he wants from a novel, is not the same as the attitude of a realist or indeed a romanticist writer. The best case for this is, in fact, probably Madame Bovary herself. I can remember my mum saying that when she first read Madame Bovary, when she was 18, she sympathized really heavily with Emma Bovary, and she thought, wow, wasn't it so tough for women in the 19th century, they're sort of shackled to their husbands, and she's trying to escape, but she can't, right? And she thought of Emma Bovary as a kind of heroine, a hero. Then when she read it some years later, when she was 30, she didn't sympathize with Emma Bovary at all. She thought she was stupid, immoral, selfish, egotistical. And it's not like there's an answer to that question. In a realist novel, in Dickens, for example, we sympathize with Oliver Twist, right? We want Oliver Twist to do well. He's a nice chap, and it's society that's at fault. In a Flaubert novel, we don't know we can't tell if Emma is a good person or a bad person. The novel remains ambivalent about the nature of the world it's describing, and it's not trying to sell us on a position on the world. It's not trying to tell us, for example, the Romantics will tell you society is bad, more or less, or the realists might tell you, it's tough in the coal mines. Flaubert isn't interested in trying to convince you of something about the world. He's just trying to show the world as it is. In this sense, you might think of it as more realist than a realist novel, but in the sense that it's not trying to convince you of anything, it doesn't fall within the genre constraints of a naturalist or a realist novel. And a famous quote of Flaubert's, which is a cliché of Flaubertian criticism, but is nonetheless very revealing, is l'auteur doit être dans son œuvre comme Dieu dans l'univers, présent partout, visible nulle part. So, l'auteur, the author, doit être, must be, dans son œuvre, in his work, comme Dieu dans l'univers, like God in the world, présent partout, present everywhere, and nowhere visible. To repeat that, the author must be in his work, in his novel, like God in the universe, present everywhere, visible nowhere. And what he means by that is we don't want the author coming in and telling us how to feel about things. We want simply the presence of the author to be felt, and yet what the author actually thinks, what God actually thinks, to be unclear. And this is why Madame Bovary is such an enigmatic novel, and it's something you can read and reread, because even the main character, let alone all of the other characters, remains an enigma. And that's also why, in some sense, I think of it as a modern novel, because the modernist writers, and again, apologies for all the jargon, but the writers that came after Flaubert are more interested in letting the world sit, as it were, without trying to convince you of a particular case. Knausgaard is a contemporary writer, Norwegian writer, and I quite like what his 2 cents are on Madame Bovary. He says, I've read the novel many times, and its details are so vivid. The world is clear and crisp as a landscape after a heavy rainfall. I think it's much better than In Search of Lost Time. Proust doesn't have that kind of concentration. Flaubert is interesting. I just read his letters, and they really go backstage. He writes about the most obscene things, sex, prostitutes, what have you. They're as chaotic. His letters are as chaotic as life itself. And then you see that perfectly constructed facade of a novel, which in a way contains it all, but indirectly. It, by which he means Madame Bovary, is highly controlled and composed. That made me realize that the value of Bovary is much higher, 1,000 times higher than the letters, even though the letters, he means Flaubert's correspondence, are livelier and closer to life. It's about creating a universe that's entirely self-contained and not just true, but actually valid. It's that validity, which in the best books is endless, that is perhaps the true nature of literature. It's kind of a mysterious quotation. Hopefully when we get to the passage itself and we get to describing it, we can make some of these statements of Knausgaard's a little clearer. But one of the important things to notice about this is Madame Bovary is a compound. It's a very compacted world that's constructed within itself. It's a tightly bound novel. It's got a classic sort of 3-act tragic structure where every detail kind of sings. And yet, because of the intensity of the description and the ambivalence of the characters, the novel remains enigmatic. and it's that enigmatic quality which means that it is literary in a sense. That we can keep returning to Madame Bovary as a classic, as a masterpiece. So there are two ways of discussing a novel. One is to look at the themes of a novel. So one theme might be women's freedom, right, in the 19th century. Another theme might be medicine in the 19th century, and so on. The other way of looking at it is in terms of its style. And tend to be, when we do this course, we'll look at both ways of discussing literature. Here I'm going to be looking at, in particular, Flaubert's style, and how the writing in itself, without trying to make a point about life, is of value, of interest. One thing Flaubert does very well is maintain this ambivalence, which I've sort of identified with departure from romanticism and realism. Ambivalence means having two ambi values or tastes competing simultaneously. So Emma Bovary is at the same time a freedom fighter and an egotist, right? One of the ways he's able to create that ambivalence is through the use of free indirect discourse, which the French will tell you Flaubert invented. English tend to think that Jane Austen came up with free indirect discourse. It's more or less been always present in literature, but is used to particularly good effect in Flaubert. Now, this is a particularly quick technical question, but I wonder if anyone could hazard a guess about free indirect discourse. What I might mean by free indirect discourse in a novel. I certainly didn't know what this meant when I was 17, but it's a technique that once you hear about it, you see it everywhere. And in writing today, it is everywhere. To give you a clue here, discourse is dialogue, right? It's people talking. And direct discourse is kind of classic dialogue. So I want to go outside, Sophie said, right? Quotation marks. I want to go outside, comma, Sophie said. That's direct discourse. We're getting a direct quote from Sophie. Now, indirect discourse is when we still have dialogue, we still have discourse, but it's not quoted directly. Sophie said she wants to go outside, right? Now, we don't have the quotation marks. We do know that Sophie said it, but what she said is being summarized by us. We might even say, Sophie said she felt like going outside. So we're not using her exact words. And we don't have the quotation marks, so we don't have to use her exact words. We're just indirectly summarizing what is being said. Free indirect discourse, which is used in the extract we'll see today, is when you have the words or the thoughts of someone indirectly put into a novel, and you don't attribute their author. So perhaps the best way of looking at this is simply to jump forward to the passage itself. Here we see in quotation C a passage where we have some of Emma Bovary's thoughts that aren't assigned to Emma Bovary in the novel. Okay, so, mais dans ce geste qu'elle fit en se cambrant sur sa chaise, elle aperçut au loin, tout au fond de l'horizon, la vieille diligence des hirondelles qui descendait lentement la côte des Leux en traînant après soi un long panache de poussière. First sentence. Elle, she, Emma Bovary, sitting on her chair, saw in the distance this post car carrying the post, moving on the horizon, right? Second sentence. So that isn't indirect discourse. That's just a description of what's going on with Emma Bovary. Second sentence. C'était dans cette voiture jaune que Léon si souvent était revenu vers elle, et par cette route là-bas, il était parti pour toujours. It was in this car, in this postilion, that this chap Leon so frequently came towards her, and it was on that road that he had left forever. First sentence, we see Emma Bovary observing the road. Second sentence, we hear her thoughts. We hear her imagining or remembering that it was in this postilion, in that very same postcar, that Léon, this chap, came back and forth and left. And we feel her longing for him to return. And yet the thought isn't attributed to Emma Bovary. Flaubert isn't telling us, and Emma Bovary said to herself, it was in that voiture jaune que Léon était revenu vers elle. Right? It was in that postcard that Leon so frequently came towards her. We just have the sentence without attribution. What this allows Flaubert to do is to constantly be flitting in and out of the thoughts of different characters. We hear Flaubert's Emma Bovary's internal monologue. We hear the internal monologue of many other characters, without it being precise exactly who is talking or what is being said. In a realist novel, if someone comes into a room and the narrator says, Hilary was looking very ugly today, the state of play is we believe that Hilary was actually looking very ugly, right? Because the narrator is omniscient, all-knowing, and the narrator is giving us a state of facts of the case. Whereas in fact, in a Flaubert novel, if Charles Bovary comes into the room and we hear Charles Bovary was looking very ugly today, we're not sure to what extent he's actually looking ugly, or whether we're actually hearing Emma Bovary's thoughts on how ugly Charles Bovary is because he's a terrible husband. And so it's that kind of ambiguity, this generalized ambiguity, that free and direct discourse sort of creates in Madame Bovary, which means that, again, ambivalence reigns supreme. We don't know how small Emma Bovary's house is. We just know that to her, it seems small, right? We don't know how pretty Rodolphe is, right? Or whatever it might be. We see Emma Bovary at the same time from the perspective of her lovers. We never actually see her as she really is. There is no really is in the novel, in a sense. And the other excellent thing about Madame Bovary is just this incredible rhythm. Flaubert is able to move between summary, where he summarizes a whole life in a page, to intense, precise description, 6 pages on half a day, without us even noticing that he's changed his narratorial style. Between this rhythm of set-piece scenes, set-piece parties, and summary of long-term events, there's also the sentence rhythm. He's really excellent at getting a sentence to flow from another sentence, varying sentence lengths, thinking very carefully about right down to the syllable count of certain sentences. And Proust, who's a French writer who came after Flaubert, wrote a very good article on this, noticing that Flaubert actually includes words in his sentences that don't need to be there. He might use 2 adjectives that mean the same thing, or he might use an extra and when he doesn't need an and. We'll see an example of that soon. And Proust suggests the reason he does this is in fact to get the syllable count right. So he's paying so much attention to detail in each one of his sentences that he's constructing them as if he were a poet, thinking about internal rhyme schemes, the number of syllables in each part of the sentence. And you can really feel that if you read Madame Bovary, maybe on a second time or a third time, that attention to detail is almost superhuman, because he's got the attention of a poet, but he's maintaining it consistently for hundreds of pages. it's quite outrageous, really, as a feat of human effort, almost. Okay, so that's bits and pieces about Emma Bovary. It would be great, instead of me going on, to hear a bit about how you experience the passage. Before I do that, I thought it would be good to mention how I think you should approach passages. This might be something that you're interested in because Oxford and Cambridge do interviews where they give you passages. But it's also just a general, it's a good skill as a reader in general life to be able to dissect why something has interested you, or what is going on in any given piece of literature. Now, if I were to be approaching a passage to talk about it, or to write something on it, I tend to have a personal checklist in my head to make sure I haven't left anything out. First thing I'd always do is give a summary of what's going on in the passage, just 1 or 2 sentences. And then I would be thinking about what are the key themes in the text. Can I arrange my subsequent analysis by the themes? Or can I arrange it by the progression of the text? Those are 2 different ways of analyzing a passage. The first is by thinking of, for example, in what ways are women treated in this passage, right? And breaking it down, and then doing another section on, say, in what ways is the countryside valorized, right? These would be 2 themes. The other way is by looking at the way the passage flows as a whole and picking out key moments. And then in my personal checklist, which I could write down, I would have in my head, I would also try to remember all of these other bits and pieces you can talk about, like the narrator's voice, figures of rhetoric, simile, pathetic fallacy, metaphor, and so on. But what is the most important, I think, is, first of all, before you do any of that, to introspect, to think to yourself, how does this passage make me feel? And whether you like it or not, frankly. It's often assumed that it has to be good because it's classic. But the first thing to do is actually think, was I interested by that? And if I wasn't interested by that, why wasn't I interested by it? You always have a response to a text, just like a human face. Even if you don't necessarily realize it, subconsciously you naturally respond to a human face when you see one in the bus or something. And the skill for me, in order to produce original analysis, is to go back through your subconscious reaction to the text and to think about how that actually made you feel, and then to ask why. Anyway, those are my tips for approaching a passage. I wonder if anyone had a go at reading this, perhaps in English, perhaps even first of all in French. Flaubert writes a very tricky French, so props to you if you did. Were there any reactions to this particular piece that we sent you? Fair enough. It was a fairly challenging passage, and let us know if you felt it could have been shorter, or it could have been perhaps better packaged to you to make it more readily available. Would anyone want to give just a few sentences summary of what actually happens? What if someone hasn't read this, what is going on here? Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's very good. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the summary is, it's nice to pick out a few details so you can discuss them later, but you just want to give an overall impression of what is actually happening here. You've understood, the basic principles of the passage, what happens, how it moves from what appears to be Rodolphe expressing his undying passion, right, to somehow an agricultural show. Right? Not to pick on you, but I wonder what you made of that. What was your impression of having these two things sort of juxtaposed, to use a word that English teachers love, in the passage? Yeah, I think that's right. And then the question is, why? Why does he come across as a bit of a buffoon in this passage, or a dilettante? Is it that? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah, very welcome to. Mm, yeah. Okay. I like that. So there's somehow, perhaps you might say that this kind of droning, this discourse of his about, we're two rivers that will come together, we're two souls that life has brought together, etc., etc. All of this kind of romantic, not small r romantic, romantic in the common parlance, rubbish, mirrors the way that in the discourse in the agricultural show, there's a similar kind of droning on about pigs and sheep and growing crops and courgettes and whatever it might be, right? So in one sense, you might say that the silliness of Rodolphe's commonplaces are mirrored by the commonplaces in the agricultural show. You might, on the other hand, the exact opposite point, you might say that the romance, the made-up romance of Rodolphe is undercut by the reality of the agricultural show, insofar as he's talking about love, and right outside the window, you've got people talking about manure. The real, the harsh realities, as it were, of life. The courgettes, the pigs, the things that they need to exist, rather than this sort of made-up fantasy land. So, in some sense, I would say both things are going on, right? There's the droning of his discourse is offset by the reality of the agricultural show, and at the same time, it's compounded by the irreality of the discourses in that very agricultural show. Now, does anyone else have some potential impressions? That's good to hear from you. I'm sorry I don't have your name on this. I just have you as guest, but good to hear that interaction. Mm-hmm. So you were cutting out a little bit, but what I heard sounded really interesting. So you're suggesting that there's a kind of steadiness to the overall prose, but you have these piquant moments where you get an insight into the anxiety of Emma Bovary and Rodolphe as well. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And did you cite one I couldn't quite.
Just now, for example, when I went to your house and then back to a standard, the people that are talking in the background, and then did I know I should accompany you? Like 100 times I wish to go and I followed you, and then Meniere's, and it's just like so ridiculous in how it juxtaposes, um,
Yeah.
and it kind of heightens like how ridiculous some of his sentiments might be, um, because they're set against something that is just like kind of flat in comparison and very workaday, and I'm sure impassioned, but just it just doesn't level up. And then at the end of that section, Rodolphe was pressing her hand, and he felt it all warm and quivering like a captive dove that wants to fly away. And it just made me feel like that back and forth also felt like the internal either attraction or confusion or like complete lack of attraction, that just like makes you like a bit sparky and
I see. So you get this kind of brief insight to Emma through this metaphor, right? The hand that wants to fly away. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the kind of this is the same bit that I picked as the kind of the heart of the passage. This is certainly, if you like, the climax, where um, we have a series of short repartees broken between Rodolphe confessing his love, quote unquote love, and these the contradiction or the juxtaposition that is underground the whole time suddenly becomes very, very apparent because of this breaking between speeches from the ceremony that's going on and the love scene, right? And you're right, it's ridiculous. It's really funny, right? It's intended to be funny, and I think it is really funny. You got this guy, saying, "I loved you all my life. I think about you all the time," and then you've got someone going, "Manures, for a merino sheep, 25 francs, etc." But the richness of that humor, and I think both people we've heard from have noticed it, but it's hard to articulate. And I think it's hard to articulate because it's not a direct metaphor. It's not like, for example, we can say that Emma Bovary is selling herself to this man. She's being sold like a cow in the same way that the cows are being sold outside, right? It's not a metaphor as simple as a pathetic fallacy in many novels where, it's raining outside and the person inside is sad, right? This juxtaposition isn't a direct juxtaposition. There's a kind of there remains a sort of ambivalence even in this separation of the romantic world and the real world, if you like, which gives it its kind of enigmatic appeal. It's funny, but we don't necessarily know what he's trying to tell us, right? What Flaubert is trying to say by having the agricultural show going on at the same time as the romantic life, right? And to look at this, so this is the extract we're talking about in French. To look at this, talk about the dove in the hands, right? Again, to quote the part that you just quoted, Rodolphe was pressing her hand, and he felt it all warm and quivering like a captive dove that wants to fly away. Now, we get the impression Rodolphe is a dilettante, and that he's perhaps not being completely honest because he's just quoting the random cliches of romantic French wooing. He's basically just kind of, he might well be flirting with her, right, and just coming up with whatever he thinks she wants to hear. And so we sense Emma Bovary perhaps wanting to fly away in that sense, to escape this tempter, right? At the same time, this image of the dove in the hand strikes me as an image which is slightly cliched in itself. The dove, this pure, white, pure, obvious symbol, if you like, being caught by man, the woman being tamed and shackled and tied into a small space, which means that we must hesitate, as always in Madame Bovary, with attributing this description directly to the narrator, saying this is how it actually was, that Emma Bovary actually was a dove caught in his hand. This might well be free and direct discourse, and it might well be how Rodolphe is imagining her, because he has a cliched romantic brain, and he finds that appealing to think that he has caught this woman, like one of the animals in the marketplace. This is another example that basically I want to point out of where free and direct discourse means that it's too simple to straightforwardly say Emma Bovary was caught by Rodolphe, as you can read here. She's referred to as a dove in the hand. Oh, I'm not saying you were saying that. I'm just pointing out that this quality of ambivalence adheres to almost every part of the prose whenever you have a piece of description that appears to be in the narrator's voice. I don't know whether that's if that point is coming across or not. If it's not coming across, you're very welcome to say so. If you have any other thoughts on this passage, it'd be great to hear them. Yeah, I think that's right. There's some of the logic of romancing at the time, right? If I make the claim that, and it's still the logic of romancing today, if I make the claim that I'm devoted to you, then I expect something from you in return. Right? And I think Rodolphe is aware of that. He's he's a cynical chap who assumes that, and assumes almost correctly, that Emma Bovary will be drawn to someone who speaks this kind of slightly problematic, to use another word which is much loved today, discourse, and so he opens up on it. He goes in. He throws all of his chips into the "I loved you. I've loved you my whole life since the first time I saw you. We'll be together forever," etc. Flirtation technique, as it were. It's precisely that way in which nothing quite comes together so that you know exactly where we stand, that requires the reader to do this work, and fills me with appreciation for the way he can his observational power, because that's also the way in life. It's very rare that you're 100% in love with someone. There's always this kind of reticence. You're always kind of in this sort of ambivalence gray zone where you feel like maybe you're being caught, or maybe you're being maybe you're giving yourself up. You put it much better than I did, I think, in the first part of that commentary, and I'm glad that's a good one to end it on. I think we'll end it there, really. To give a brief summary, then. Oh, some translations here, just before we open up to general questions. There've been over 20 translations of Madame Bovary. The classic one is Marx, Eleanor Marx, daughter of Karl Marx. That's your standard, I would say. Emma Bovary in English is what I probably would recommend. Lydia Davis has a new one. That would perhaps be the other option. Much less fusty approach, much more to attempt to bring Flaubert's prose into the contemporary English and to bring it as straightforwardly as possible across. So if you want the old feel, Emma Bovary, then Eleanor Marx, and briefly, if you want something new and exciting, if you want to read a novel that perhaps doesn't feel like it was written in the 19th century, then Lydia Davis is a very good translation. And that was more or less what I intended to do with the lesson. Thanks very much for your for everyone's chiming in with comments that were always very perceptive.
Okay, fab. So the course in summer will be running from lessons will be a bit longer than the one today. They're 1.5 hours long, and they'll take place in the evenings. Homework would be similar to what it's been today, just sending out some pre-reading for you to get a feel for the text and then discuss it in the lesson. All of the lessons will be recorded. So if you ever miss a day, then you will obviously be sent a recording. And even if you want to watch a recording back of the lesson that you've attended, they'll all be recorded. So you can always access any lesson that you want to revise or anything.